Good afternoon. So we last mentioned that Rebbe Yehudah felt that since a miracle had occurred to him, he needed to institute something similar to what Yaakov Avinu had done when he was saved miraculously from the clutches of Lavan. So Amari said, Ika milsa deboy litkuni, is there something here that has to be rectified? They said to him, Ika duchta de isbe safek tuma, there is a place where there is a question about whether or not there's any tuma, any ritual impurity. The question was whether or not there were any dead bodies buried there. And therefore, v'islu tsara lekohanim, there's discomfort for kohanim who are not allowed to come into contact with any dead bodies. La'akufi, because they always have to go around that area. So it was a question whether or not there were dead bodies buried there. Therefore, Kohanim were always being inconvenienced, and they asked Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, if there's anything he could do to rectify that, since he offered to rectify something. Amar, he said, Ika inish diyoda dischazek hachatara. Is there anybody here who knows that this was an area that in the past there was a presumption that it was tahar, that nobody was buried there? So Amar Le'ahu Saba, so this old man said to Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, Kan kitzetz ben Zakai turmasei truma. Over here, Ben Zakai, who was a Kohen, had planted and then harvested gourds of truma, and truma is only permitted to a Kohen, and he was a Kohen and he was busy over there. So in order to demonstrate that the area was not tameh, avad iunami hachi, he also did this. But he instituted the following. Kol hechadavi kashi, wherever the ground was hard, and therefore did not seem that any bodies were buried there, tahare, he declared it tar. V'chol hechadavi rafi, but where the ground was soft, and therefore possibly had been dug up in the past, tzaine, he marked it. It's actually an interesting Rashi. Rashi says, a little different than the way I just explained it, that Hoya Mikatzetz Turmisin, the Reb Shimon Bar Yochai cut down these gourds, Umashlichan Sham, and he tossed them onto the area where there was a question that perhaps there was Tumah. V'nasanes, and a miracle occurred. V'tsof hames b'makom shehu sham, and the dead bodies floated up out of the ground. Hachi mefarish v'psikta de parshas Omer b'seder zroyim, and he explains that this is Yerushalmi, that this is how the story is brought down in a version in the Medrash called the Psikta, as well as in the Talmud Yerushalmi. Mirza Hashem, later this week, we will actually spend some time going through the Yerushalmi's version of the story, which is different. By the way, I forgot to mention at the beginning that we are sponsored once again in memory of Chana Devora Bas Avraham. So at that point in time, the old man started getting a little bit nervous. After all, it was on the old man's word that Reb Shimon Bar Yochai had started to declare some of the areas being tahar. Amar Husaba, the old man said, Tir ben Yochai beis hakvaros. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is now saying that this burial place is permitted to Kohanim and it's not tameh. So he was the one who had suggested it was tahar. And now after Shimon Bar Yochai declared it tar, now he's turning around and criticizing him. So Amalei, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said to the old man, Ilmale hayisa imanu, if you had not been with us from the beginning of this discussion, vafilu hayisa imanu, even if you had been standing here, v'lo nimnis imanu, and you were not involved in the discussion to begin with, Yafa ata, Omer. Then what you're saying now, accusing me, okay, I can understand why you're accusing me. But achshav shayisa imanu, v'nimnis imanu. But the fact is you were with us and you were involved in the discussion. And now after you encouraged me to do this, now you're saying I'm wrong. Yomru, people are going to say, zonos mifarchasos zu as zu, that prostitutes, before they go out to the area to meet clients, they go out and help themselves get dressed to look nice. But then when they're on the street looking for clients, they're putting each other down. So Talmidei Chacham lo kolshkein, and that's how Talmidei Chachamim, that's how Torah scholars act also. That initially you encouraged me to do something, and now you're turning around and criticizing me. That's not a way to behave. So Yohav Be'enei. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai looked at the old man, v'noch nafshei, and he died. Nafak l'shuka, and then Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai went out to the marketplace. Chazle liYehudah ben Geirim, and he saw Yehudah ben Geirim. Remember, at the beginning of the story, Rebbe Yehudah ben Geirim is the one who had told people that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had criticized the Romans, and it was thanks to his not being careful who he spoke to, the Romans found out, causing Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai to have to hide. So Amar, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, Adayin yesh lazeh ba'olam. This person is still in the world? Nasan Bo'enav, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai took one look at Yehudah ben Geirim, V'aso gal shalat samos, and he became a pile of bones. Now, a couple of interesting things about Yehudah ben Geirim. But before that, I'll just point out to you something which I'm going to put in the category of cool. I'm not convinced it necessarily means anything, but as you're well aware, that Amir Hashem, this coming Sunday, which will be Lag BaOmer, is when we celebrate Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And most of the story, except for these last few lines, is actually on Daf Lamed Gimel, on page 33 in Maseches Shabbos. And here we have at the end of the story that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is looking at Yehudah ben Geirim and turning him into a gal. Also the same letters, Lamed Gimel, a pile of bones. Now, I would like to share with you an interesting Tosfos, because here we have, at the beginning of the story, Rebbe Yehudah ben Geirim is hanging out with Rebbe Yehudah, Rebbe Yossi, and Rebbe Shimon. At the end of the story, he meets a pretty uncomfortable death. So Tosfos says that this person is properly referred to as Rebbe Yehudah ben Geirim, with the title Rebbe, which indicates that he was one of the Tanoim, one of the sages of the Mishnah. And he went ahead and told people, as we mentioned, and that's how word got about Reb Shimon Bar Yochai's criticism of the Romans to the Roman ears. Then Rabbeinu Tam says that in certain manuscripts of the Gemara, it brings down the name Yehudah ben Geirim without the title Rebbe, as if to indicate that he was not a Tana. But Rabbeinu Tam disagrees, because he quotes a Gemara in Moed Katan, in which Rabbi Yehudah ben Geirim and Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta were visiting Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And when they were leaving, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said about Rabbi Yehudah ben Geirim and Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta that they are both great people, and therefore you should go to them and ask for them a bracha. And therefore Tosfos says, Michlal de Gavra Rabba Hoya, that therefore it must be that Yehudah ben Geirim was a great person, meaning a Talmud Chacham, a Tana. And therefore Tosfos also says that even though at the end of the Gemara it says Reb Shimon bar Yochai looked at him and he became a gal shalatzamos, again a pile of bones, Tosfos says erase that from your Gemara, because that's a very demeaning way to speak about somebody. And even if he died when Reb Shimon bar Yochai looked at him, just say he died. But we shouldn't talk about this Tana who made a mistake and was not careful with how he spoke to other people and used such a term of he became a pile of bones. And just to conclude the story, I will share with you something a little bit kind of mind-blowing, and that is as follows. In the Sefer Seder Hadoros, which is a history book going all the way back to the beginning of the Chumash, through Talmudic times and later. So he mentions about this Tosfos over here. And then he says as follows, that the Zohar in Parshas Bereshis says that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was a Gilgul of Moshe Rabbeinu. He shared the same neshama as Moshe Rabbeinu. That's why Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai wrote the Safra Ditzniusa, which is really they call it the Mishnayos of Kabbalah. It's really the center part of the Zohar, which lays out very tersely the way in which the spiritual world is structured. Because the Safra Ditzniusa consists of 5 prakim, 5 chapters, and those correspond to the Chamisha Chumshei Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote. And therefore he says that that's also why we find that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai had to run away and escape, because that's similar to Moshe Rabbeinu, who when Moshe Rabbeinu did something he shouldn't have done, perhaps, and Paro found out Moshe had to run away. And so therefore now Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai spoke something, as we discussed in our last year, my belief that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was wrong with what he had said. He now had to run away. And similar to the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu ended up developing himself spiritually out in the desert and eventually, so to speak, finding Hashem in the sneh, in the burning bush, so too Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai had to go out to the desert in Lud to find Hashem. Now here's the kicker. He then says that Yehudah ben Geirim, he was a Gilgul of the Egyptian who Moshe Rabbeinu had killed. Because just like that Egyptian back then had wanted to go ahead and speak ill of Moshe before Paro, so Yehudah ben Geirim was his Gilgul, and therefore on this occasion maybe he didn't go directly and speak ill of Moshe to the Romans, but he was responsible for the fact that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai ended up in trouble with the Romans, and therefore just as he got his comeuppance from Moshe Rabbeinu, by Moshe Rabbeinu saying something and killing him, which was Midah Keneged Midah, because he wanted to say something yet Moshe Rabbeinu killed. So in the same way over here, he got his comeuppance from Shimon bar Yochai, which the Mekubalim talk about what Shemos, what names of Hashem Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai used in order to kill him, but he got his comeuppance similar to what happened to the Egyptian who Moshe Rabbeinu killed. Now that concludes the story of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai in the cave. And Mirz Hashem, in our next year, later on this week, I want to just share with you the version of the story that's found in the Talmud Yerushalmi, because over there are some interesting distinctions. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great day.